Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Charlie Rose. CBS News foreign correspondent Clarissa Ward is here, along with CBS News senior security contributor Mike Morell and Washington Post columnist David Ignatius. Let me go, Mike, first to this question of lone wolves and homegrown terror. What do you make and what do you assess from Canada and the U.S. and New York?
So, Charlie, we have had 3 attacks in the last week, 2 in Canada, 1 in New York City. There was a terrorist attack in the United States last week. The media sort of didn't pay a lot of attention to it, but there was. Also in the last month, we've had arrests in Australia, Malaysia, France, and the United Kingdom, arresting people who were planning attacks. So this is a very significant threat, this self-radicalization inspired by ISIS's message.
And how do you combat it?
I think you have to combat it a whole number of ways. Right, you have to be on these websites where these individuals are going and getting radicalized, and when they talk about violence and committing violence, you have to investigate them. And you also have to take on the narrative, although that's not something the United States can do by itself. We need the help of our allies and the help of moderate clerics in Islam to be able to fight this narrative.
This is tougher than for the intelligence agencies than simply knowing what's going on in the Middle East.
Yes, and I would also add that one of the problems we have now, and Matt Olson, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, has been very articulate about this, is what Ed Snowden did has made both the law enforcement against this problem more difficult and the intelligence against this problem more difficult.
Clarissa, you have talked to people who have been recruited. What is it that attracts them to ISIS?
I think sometimes we forget that there is a real ideology behind this. This isn't just a bunch of psychopaths who see people being beheaded online and think, I want a part of that. There's a perception among these people that they are the victims of a war that the West is waging against Islam. And so there's an appeal that comes with essentially trying to be a hero and go in and defend your religion and defend the innocent Muslims who are being persecuted. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, when you look at the shift in recruitment of radicalization, and you just touched on this, is the role to which the internet is playing. People are not being recruited any longer in mosques by clerics with very foreign-sounding names. They're being recruited online, behind closed doors, by people who speak their language, by people who they may even know, who come from their own countries, which is why some authorities are even calling it bedroom jihad. And often the families don't even know these people are being recruited. So the question becomes, if you don't know that your own son or daughter is being radicalized online, how on earth can authorities actually monitor that?
So in a sense, the message is feeding into a grievance they already have against the West, but here's a place where you can join a crusade against them.
This is a real battlefield where Muslims are taking the law into their own hands, so to speak, and fighting back against the oppression of the West. They look at the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, they look at drone strikes, and they believe fundamentally that the U.S. wants to obliterate Islam. That's their ideology.
And women, young women are included as well.
They are, and it's amazing to see how many young women are going over now to join ISIS or to marry jihadi fighters. And I think sometimes we forget in all of this that there's a certain romance to the narrative of jihad as well. You're a young teenage girl living your sort of middle-class suburban life in the UK or the US or Canada or wherever it may be, and suddenly you're talking online to this brave, handsome young warrior who's risking his life to fight jihad. There's a real romance to that narrative, especially for a teenage girl.
So we need a message, the West needs a message to counteract that and make sure it's not against Islam, but against these people. On the ground, you just were in the Middle East. Where do we stand in the fight against ISIS? And has bombing with some troops from Peshmerga and the Iraqis in Iraq made a difference?
Charlie, I've just come back from Lebanon and Jordan, which are both next to these wars, one in Syria, one in Iraq. I found people who were anxious, who wanted to see what the U.S. strategy for combating this problem was, who were, in some cases, beginning to be very impatient as the U.S. Slowly moves into its active phase.
What do they want from the United States, and is it U.S. leadership that they think is essential?
I think that people in the region are comfortable with President Obama's statement that the Arab-Muslim world has to take the lead, that the boots on the ground have to be principally in Iraq, Iraqi Peshmerga from the Kurdish part of the country, a new Sunni National Guard in the Sunni areas, Shiite fighters in the army of Iraq. In Syria, it's more complicated because that boots on the ground will have to be created. But again, I think there's an idea the administration has. What I'd emphasize, having just come back from there, is that time is really slipping away. That people have been waiting now for a month for signs that the U.S. is serious. Take the National Guard in Iraq. Sunnis are ready in the tribes, I think, to join up with this force. And yet, the weeks pass and it hasn't been created yet. If they can move quickly, and I mean
the
in
most
the next
specific thing
2
the president
weeks,
could do to make them understand he appreciates the time dimension would be what?
I think if you could get the formation of Sunni National Guard units in Iraq with major tribal leadership, 5,000 people moving toward training in the next 2 weeks, that would be crucial. If you could also get a statement by the president that the U.S. advisors will travel into combat areas with those forces, that would be crucial.
Mike?
So I think that we have to be careful that we don't get impatient here. The president made it very clear this is going to take a very long time, and he's absolutely right. My sense of where we are on the Iraq side of the border is in those cases where we've had good forces, Peshmerga or even on the Iraqi side, we have done well. We've also made a conscious decision, Charlie, not to take weak forces into battle. And so we have to make sure that when we take these forces into battle, that they're going to be effective. And that's going to take some time, so let's not get impatient here. The other thing I'd say on advisors is I would move from the brigade level to the forward operating base level in terms of advisors. But I would not put advisors with units that are actually doing the fighting. And the reason I wouldn't do that is because at the end of the day, the Iraqis have to fight this war themselves. And when you take a U.S. Special Forces guy and put him in a unit, they become Michael Jordan, they become Superman, and they take over the fighting. The Iraqis have to do this themselves. So I'd be a little cautious about putting U.S. Special Forces right on the ground with the guys doing the fighting.
Chris, I want to just take a moment to talk about Afghanistan, too. We saw today the Marines leaving Camp Leatherneck. When you look at that war, which all of you have participated in terms of different capacities, as a journalist in the CIA, after 13 years, what do we say about what we achieved, appreciating the loss in blood and treasure?
Well, I think it's difficult to make that statement just yet. I think we have to watch what happens over the coming years. I mean, December 31st is the official end to combat operations, but obviously I think there were lessons learned in Iraq, so we are leaving just under 10,000 U.S. troops, 2,000 NATO troops, and they will continue to advise and train the Afghan army, but there will also be a smaller contingency of special operations forces who will continue to launch counterterrorism raids as well. But one example that really struck me when I went to Afghanistan, I went to this base called Nangalam in the Pesh River Valley. This was some of the hottest activity. A lot of Americans died there. And they had this big ceremony to hand this base over to the Afghan troops. And there were flags and anthems, just like we saw today. And within a month, the Taliban had closed down the road that would allow the Afghan army to get their logistics and their supplies, so they weren't able to resupply. They couldn't get food, they couldn't get water, they couldn't get ammunition. And they literally went into survival mode. And they stripped the base completely bare. They weren't going out on their patrols. And within another couple of months, the Americans had to come back in, retrain, and rebuild the entire base. And that, one is very much hoping that we will avoid that scenario or a repeat of the scenario. But so far, I don't think there are any guarantees.
Mike, when you look at the front page story in the New York Times today about what happened to Jim Foley, including waterboarding, and they say, well, that's what the Americans did.
Right. In my mind, Charlie, no equivalency. What the United States did to a very small number of senior al-Qaeda operatives, the worst of the worst, was used to get information to stop attacks that were going to kill Americans. That was the intent. The intent here on the part of ISIS is just punishment.
Punishment. One last question about our allies there. And what success are we getting from Sunni Arabs in convincing Sunni militias and the provinces to come fight against ISIS and not support them and not stay on the fence?
Charlie, U.S. commanders think that they have several dozen Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq who are prepared to move toward a program that would be a kind of Sunni National Guard. And we'll see in the next couple of weeks whether that's real or not. I think going to this broader question of the long-haul fight, it's things that don't involve boots or bullets. It's changing the education system in the Muslim Middle East so that people aren't radicalized. It's working with prisoners in prison so that these don't become literally schools for jihadists. It's finding a way to talk good sense online to young people.
Fight the world of ideas.
Yes, I mean, as much as the U.S. needs to work with allies to crank up the fighting side of this, I really hope they're paying attention to the long run, because this really is a generational issue. And unless more money and effort goes into that, it's going to be the same thing every few years, I fear.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Clarissa. We'll be right back and talk about the midterm elections and politics.